Alright, so Chapter 18, Hemodynamics. That means we're getting into the home stretch here on this physics course. Alright, so hemodynamics is the physical laws that govern the flow of fluids. When we talk about flow, we're talking about volume flow rate, or volume per time. So an example would be 5 liters per minute. Velocity is different from flow. Velocity is the speed and direction of the blood, so how fast the blood is moving, and this is usually given in centimeters per second or meters per second, depending on your machine. Velocity is what we measure when we do a Doppler of the blood flow with the pulse wave Doppler, and that is an important indicator of whether or not there's a hemodynamic stenosis. We have some different flow states that we get concerned about. Steady flow is any fluid moving at a constant speed or velocity, and so this is generally, in the body, the only place that we have a constant speed of velocity is between two organs, and that would be where the portal venous flow is, and that's the most steady flow that we have in the body. Pulsatile flow is flow that is variable velocity, and it results from cardiac contractions, so we get this arterial blood flow is pulsatile. Phasic flow results from respiration, the movement of the diaphragm up and down, and we call that venous flow. In venous flow, that's typically what we see as phasic flow in the veins. The exception, of course, being the portal vein, which has steady flow. We have something known as flow velocity profiles, and this is layered blood flow. Laminar is layered, and so we have layered blood flow, and this is where in steady state flow, and this only applies to steady state, the flow in the center of the vessel, or the center of a tube, will be faster than the flow on the edges because of frictional forces along the edges. So you have faster flow in the center and progressively slower flow on the outsides. Laminar flow streams are aligned and parallel to the vessel walls. So if you have a curved vessel, this is not going to apply to it. This has to be a straight vessel. And this is what's found in the normal physiologic state, is laminar flow. Now, laminar flow can be parabolic or plug pattern. So parabolic flow is what we see in steady state flow, and plug flow is what we see in acceleration. And in plug flow, you see the velocities are nearly identical across the flow profile. In parabolic, it's faster in the center and slower on the edges, so we call it parabolic because of the shape that it gives it. There's something called a Reynolds number, and that is a number that indicates whether or not something is turbulent or laminar. If it's under 1500, it's laminar flow. So that's kind of how Reynolds number works, is under 1500 it's laminar flow. Over 1500 it's going to, or over 2000 it's going to be turbulent flow. Between 1500 and 2000 it just depends on a variety of circumstances whether it's turbulent or laminar. But laminar flow, Reynolds number under 1500. The unique thing about Reynolds number is that it's a unitless number. So most unitless numbers are useless. However, if you're talking about Reynolds number, it has no units, but it's a very valuable number for determining whether flow is turbulent or laminar. So turbulent flow is when we have chaotic flow in all directions and speeds. there are no streamlines in turbulent flow. And I want to go back to this previous picture here. You can actually see the streamlines in the water as it's coming out of this hose. You can see these different, if you look real carefully, you can see streamlines in that. That is definitely laminar flow. So when we look at the water coming out of this hose, where the young child has his thumb on the end of it, it is definitely turbulent flow. So turbulent flow is chaotic, and it means it goes in all directions and speeds. There's no streamlines. Because of the change of directions and the eddy currents, this has a significant loss of energy in this. Turbulent flow is associated with pathologic conditions, and it has a Reynolds number greater than 2000. So when we have a stenosis, at the beginning of the stenosis we'll have plug flow. As it accelerates, once it's accelerated, we'll have laminar flow at high velocities, and then when the blood exits the stenosis, it will become turbulent flow in all directions, and we'll see blood going everywhere, well, within the vessel. There's something called an energy gradient in the body, and this is what forces blood to move. So when there's an energy gradient, a difference in energy from one location to the other, blood will flow from higher energy to lower energy. The blood, of course, gets its energy from the contraction of the heart, and in systole it has its greatest kinetic energy, or motion energy. The pressure of the blood in the system, the blood pressure, is considered the potential energy that is available along with gravitational energy. So pressure and gravitational energy are both potential energies that can help affect the blood flow. So we have three forms of energy loss within the blood vessels. We have friction. This is the conversion of energy into heat due to blood sliding along the vessel wall. The viscosity of the blood can cause a loss of energy. The viscosity you could think of as the thickness of the blood. It's measured in units called poise. It results from the fluid basically sticking to itself, what we would call internal friction. Anytime you have an elevated hematocrit or hemoglobin, this will increase the viscosity. Anemia, where there's a loss of blood cells, it will decrease the viscosity of the blood. Then the last form of energy loss is inertia. And because all objects have inertia, the tendency to resist change in the velocity, with pulsatile flow we have both acceleration and deceleration, and velocity changes also occur at a stenosis. Definitely the most energy loss in the blood comes from inertial changes. That could be a test question. I think I'd remember that one. So let's talk about energy. We have the kinetic energy, the energy of motion, which is determined by the mass of the fluid and the speed of its motion. We have the potential energy. In blood, this is determined by the blood pressure and the gravitational pressure that's acting on it. The gravitational energy, which is a form of potential energy, and it's associated with height. It works out to be about, when a person is standing, about 32 millimeters of mercury per foot of height is the pressure. So your feet, if you're 6 foot tall, you'd multiply 32 by 6, and that would tell you how many millimeters of mercury pressure is on your feet just from gravity alone. So as I mentioned before, flow occurs when an energy gradient exists between 2 points. If you have kinetic energy, this is actual blood flowing, and potential energy is the pressure of the blood. Flow will occur anytime there's a difference in energy between 2 points along the vessel. Let's talk about our energy losses in a little more detail. Energy is lost in 3 ways: viscosity loss, frictional loss, and inertial loss. Viscosity loss is determined in blood by the hematocrit, and so the blood must overcome energy losses due to its thickness. Again, viscosity is measured in units of poise. You can think of honey as a liquid with a very high viscosity, and water or alcohol as a very low viscosity liquid. Energy losses due to friction are when objects slide along one another, generating heat, such as blood sliding along a vessel wall or arms sliding along roads. This is my cousin who decided to take his motorcycle out for a ride one day. He's not a very good rider. Inertial energy losses are due to the fact that the blood wants to stay either in motion or at rest. So due to the heart pumping, there's a constant change of moving and slowing down, moving and slowing down, and this results in inertial energy losses. There we go, inertial energy losses. I'm actually not sure how it's spelled. Is it Isaac like that, or the way I had it? Anyhow, so inertial energy losses are due to the pulsatile flow. Some occurs during phasic flow, but it certainly occurs during turbulent flow. So in turbulent flow you have the greatest inertial losses. And inertial energy losses are the greatest loss of energy throughout the body. So here's an explanation of Reynolds number. Reynolds number is the inertial forces divided by the viscous forces. If your inertial forces, which are density, velocity, and the diameter of the vessel, divided by the viscosity, which is given by the Greek letter nu, if this is greater than 2000, we would have turbulent flow, and if it's less than 1500, then it's laminar flow. Now, if you work out the units for density, velocity, and area diameter, you'll see that the units are exactly equal to the units for viscosity. So when we divide this inertial forces by the viscous forces, we're left with a unitless number, and that's how we got that. We just call it Reynolds number, and what you need to remember is Reynolds number above 2000 is turbulent flow. Reynolds number below 1500 is laminar flow. Can't make it more simple than that. Let's talk about what happens at a stenosis. So stenosis, by definition, is a narrowing of the lumen of the vessel. It has this effect on blood flow. You get a change in velocity. After the stenosis, you get turbulence and loss of streamlines. After the stenosis, there's eddy currents and vortices that appear. In this area, flow energy is converted to sound or tissue vibrations such as bruits or thrills. And there ends up being a decreased pressure gradient across the vessel. So the pressure will actually drop. and you also end up with a conversion of normal pulsatile flow to steady flow. This is due to the actions of the blood going through a narrowing. So what happens to blood going through a narrowing is determined by what we call Bernoulli's principle. And I always like to joke about Bernoulli's principle was written by Bernoulli's brother, because it turns out there was like 6 Bernoulli brothers, and all of them had something to do with science that was different. But one of the Bernoulli brothers came up with the Bernoulli principle that states that, I'm going to sum it up a little bit quicker than what's written here. The velocity at a stenosis increases. Okay. We have something called the Bernoulli's equation that you can utilize to figure out exactly how much it increases. That has to do with the ratio of the first velocity over the first pressure is equal to or greater than the velocity of the second velocity over the second pressure. But really all you need to know is, because of Bernoulli's principle, velocities increase at a stenosis. So volumetric pressure flow, let's talk about that real quick. So volumetric flow is directly related to the pressure difference. We'll call that delta P, the change in pressure. It's indirectly related to the resistance to flow, which we're going to call capital R, resistance. And we're going to call volumetric flow Q. So Q is equal to the change in pressure divided by the resistance. Another way you can say it is the change in pressure is equal to the flow times the resistance. So when we have a pressure gradient, we're looking at flow times resistance. Pressure gradients increase when flow increases, and it increases when resistance increases. Flow itself will increase when the pressure increases, and flow will increase when the resistance increases. Many times, for some reason, and I do not know why, ultrasound educators want you to know that this pressure flow, volumetric pressure flow equation, which is Q equals delta P over R, is essentially equivalent to an electrical phenomenon we call Ohm's law. So fluid movement is very analogous to electricity. There is a pressure gradient in both electricity and fluid movement. In electricity we call that pressure gradient voltage. In electricity we call flow current, and resistance is just simply resistance. So we end up with Ohm's law, which is the voltage equals the current times the resistance. And if we go back to the equation for pressure flow, the pressure, analogous to voltage, is equal to the flow divided or times the resistance, which means that current in electricity is equal to voltage divided by resistance. So those are our analogy between Ohm's law and hemodynamics flow, volumetric flow. What do you need to know about Ohm's law? I'm going to sum it up for you real quick. Ohm's law is analogous to the volumetric flow equation, where voltage is analogous to pressure, current's analogous to flow, and resistance is still resistance. There you go. Now let's talk about venous hemodynamics. These are a little different. So venous hemodynamics are controlled by the muscles of the body other than the heart. Okay, obviously the heart controls most of the arterial hemodynamics, but the other muscles really are what drive venous hemodynamics. So in the normal state, veins have a very low pressure. The venous walls are collapsible, usually partially filled with blood. And in the normal state, the cross-sectional shape is flattened. So what we're looking at here is the low transmural pressure, and you can see that the wall of the vessel is flattened. When you have high transmural pressure, it's rounded, which means that's not good. Okay, that's not a normal state. So in an increased flow environment, the veins will increase their roundness and filling of the vessel to accommodate large volume changes. And what this does is it changes the volume of blood that is able to flow without changing the velocity of the blood significantly. The change in shape is associated with increases in venous volume changes. So veins can accommodate large changes in volume with small changes in pressure or small changes in velocities of the blood. However, once a vein becomes distended, it requires a large amount of pressure to change the venous volume. What does that mean to us in ultrasound? It means that if you see a round vein in the leg that's not really that easily collapsible, there's probably something closer to the heart that is causing a backup of blood, and so they look for a clot that's more proximal to the, or more central to where your probe is, if the veins are all distended. Yeah, you'll get that in the vascular course. All right, hydrostatics. Hydrostatics is the pressure caused by the weight of fluid as measured compared to a reference point, and this is due to gravity. So in our bodies, we always will say that the right atrium is the reference point. So the right atrium is the reference point, and hydrostatic pressure is the density of the blood, which is given by this little symbol rho, times gravity, the acceleration due to gravity, times the height of the blood column. And it gives us a result in millimeters of mercury. So we see here in this drawing a person standing, the arterial pressure from the, well, in this case, if it's arterial, it's from the left ventricle up to a certain height has dropped. There's 40 millimeters of mercury of loss of pressure with this hand up here. Okay, so the dynamic pressure from the heart is about 95 millimeters of mercury. The hydrostatic pressure is about, it takes away 50 millimeters of mercury. So if you're standing up and you raise your hand above your head, you have about a blood pressure of about 45 millimeters of mercury at that point in your arm. This is why we have patients sit down and keep their arm at the level of their heart when we're measuring it. Now conversely, if we look at the pressure in the feet, we have a dynamic pressure from the heart of 95. We have an increase because of this patient's height in centimeters. It's about 140 centimeters, I guess, from the heart to the feet. And that gives us an increase of 102 millimeters of mercury for a total pressure in the feet of 197 millimeters of mercury. Now if we look at the venous side, on the venous side there's no dynamic pressure. Once the blood is trying to return, there's some dynamic pressure from the muscles acting on the blood vessels. Hydrostatic pressure is again 102, and the pressure in the veins of the feet now is 117 millimeters of mercury. And so that has to be overcome for the blood to get back to the heart, and we'll talk about how that happens in a little bit. In the arm that's raised over the head, again, there's minimal dynamic pressure due to the muscles. The hydrostatic pressure is -50, just as it was in the artery, and we're left with a total pressure of 5. And so if you take 15 minus 50, you're going, well, isn't that negative pressure? And no, the pressure in the veins can never go below the interstitial pressure of the tissues. So it stays at 5. That's the approximate interstitial tissue of the tissues. Interstitial pressure of the tissues, excuse me. So let's lay our patient down. When they're laying down, hydrostatic pressure is negligible throughout the body. Venous dynamics at rest. When you're at rest, during inspiration, the diaphragm descends and the pressure in the chest cavity decreases. This causes blood to pool in the pulmonary vascular bed, and it also acts to pull air into the lungs. This also increases the intra-abdominal pressure and forces the inferior vena cava to collapse, and therefore the venous return from the legs is impeded. So venous return from the legs stops on deep breaths. During expiration, the diaphragm goes up, it ascends. The intra-abdominal pressure decreases, so flow then can move from the legs into the abdomen, and the pressure increases in the chest cavity, and blood is decreased in the thorax, air is exhaled, and that is phasic. That just described phasic flow of blood. Every time you take in a breath, the blood flows closer to the heart. You let it out, it actually is getting closer to the heart. Depends on whether you're above or below the diaphragm. Alright, so venous hemodynamics at rest, inspiration in the legs, and this is kind of flipped around so that the legs are on the left here. The pressure increases, decreases, the flow cannot go from the legs into the abdomen. During expiration, the flow from the legs can then travel to the abdomen. Okay. So we're going to summarize it, and by the way, this was on the SPI exam when I took it last time. On inspiration, the diaphragm moves downward, thoracic pressure decreases, abdominal pressure increases, venous return to the heart increases, and venous flow in the legs decreases. On expiration, the diaphragm moves upward toward the thorax, thoracic pressure increases, abdominal pressure decreases, venous return to the heart decreases, but flow from the legs increases into the abdominal cavity. So venous flow in the legs correlates with movement of the diaphragm. Downward movement of the diaphragm slows down the flow in the legs. Upward movement of the diaphragm speeds up the flow in the legs. Venous flow above the diaphragm is the opposite. And that concludes our presentation on hemodynamics. So Hope you enjoyed that.